Hello, everyone. This is Ed Breniger, and welcome to the Eddie Network podcast. My guest today is a return guest, my friend Sue Heatherington, and she is a poet. And as you know, I have been featuring poets here on the podcast over the last few weeks, and we're going to talk about poetry. And I don't know exactly what we're going to talk about in regards to poetry, but we're going to talk about it. And maybe I can persuade her to read one of her poems, which I just the thought of that, makes the whole day complete. So welcome.
Well, Ed, it's lovely to be here. And reconnecting with you again, because actually the last time we spoke, we did end up touching on poetry. And that was a really interesting experience for me because other people call me a poet, but I don't particularly call myself a poet. Maybe we'll come to that in a minute. But that sense of where we ended up in the conversation was exploring the nature of seeing and what that means in terms of words and how we use words and how we create the kind of space that is so desperately needed in today's world, not just for more information, but actually space to reflect, to contemplate, to see the world through different eyes. So it's a good place to be picking up again today. Thank you.
Okay, I have a question for you, and I need to put some background to this question. And the part of that background is how we feel with a poem or with anything that's been written. And my question is things like, or anything that's written, is it written simply to be read, or should we consider that it's not finished until it's been heard, meaning that it's been read to us, because when we hear it audibly, there's something different in the character of the written word when it's heard rather than simply read.
I think the answer to that is it depends.
It depends.
I don't think there is a straightforward answer. And part of the reason I say that is when I was writing my book, Quiet Disruptors, Creating Change Without Shouting, one of the people I quoted in the book is the poet Gideon Hugh, who's a just astonishing young man writing the most amazing stuff. And when I contacted him to say, is it okay, can I refer to you, can I use your words, and I gave him a suggestion of how I might describe him, because I did a brief thumbnail sketch of each person that I quoted at the back of the book. And I talked about him being a spoken word poet, because actually that's how I'd encountered him. I'd encountered him speaking out poetry.
Okay.
And really quickly he came back saying, no, you can't call me a spoken word poet. He just absolutely did not identify himself with the genre, which is spoken word poetry. And if you listen, if you watch, if you observe, actually there is a distinction between written poetry and spoken word poetry. And part of that is in the intention with which it is conveyed. Someone like Sarah Kay, who's the most extraordinary spoken word poet. Check out her TED Talk, check out numbers of things. You get caught up in the experience of listening to her.
Right.
And in that sense, you almost like enter into the way she's seeing the world, because of the way in which she both crafts her words and the ways in which she expresses them. Conversely, with people who might be gravitating much more strongly to written, poetry, words that are on a page, then quite possibly your encounter with them, with that and with their words, is going to be more about the space between the words, the kind of the way it opens up, the way that you are not forced to move to the next bit until you're ready to do it. Because written poetry is much more about the spaces between. Spoken word poetry has a lot more to do with the energy with which you are
Is it
buoyed up,
more of a
carried along in the so it's actually
it's more of a performance art?
Yes, you probably would say that.
Okay.
You probably so in that sense, let's just take Shakespeare. If you take Shakespeare, then it is both performance art and it is written art.
Yeah.
You don't the performance art enables you to enter into the energy of the speaker. The written art enables you to enter into your own inner being.
Yes.
And connect with the things that you are feeling or sensing, particularly if it is in the context of you're taking it at the pace you want to take it. And interestingly too, the thing of the difference between spoken and written, with written poetry, one take is not enough. You don't write. I don't write poetry. Others don't write poetry to convey information. This is not an exercise in giving you something.
Mm-hmm.
This is an exercise in opening a window, opening a door, giving a crack of light into something that you might not otherwise see, and you don't get it in one pass. You might get, there might be one thing that you encounter the first time you read it,
Mm-hmm.
and then 10 years down the line you read it again and oh my, you encounter something else. Now, having said all of that, I'm also aware that when there are people who follow my writing. I'm a contemplative writer, and within that, I might write. I write poetically virtually all the time, but I might actually write what you might call poems rather, and often people will ask me to actually read something that I've written, and often the comment will be, "Oh my goodness, that opens up so much more than I encountered when I read it for myself." But I think that doesn't make one better than the other. That's just a different way of experiencing it.
Okay. I grant you that, definitely. But what I see happening when you hear it is it's engaging in other facets of your embodied life. You're feeling something that's not primarily cognitive. The challenge is to write something that's not cognitive, but embodied.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's unpack that a bit. I don't think poetry in the main is there to give information, to articulate a theory or a point of view. There might be a perspective that is brought to the words,
Right.
but I don't think it's there to convey something. It might be there to inspire something or to stimulate something or to provoke, but I think that's different to treating it as something that you are, as it were, getting hold of.
Part of the reason
And
that,
also, sorry, can I just the other bit I was going to say was,
okay,
and actually, I think it depends on you and your personality.
part of what drives me here,
Okay,
interview
okay.
I had last year with Johanni Pallasmaa, who is a Finnish architect and philosopher, and he had written a book called The Eyes of the Skin. And he's talking about architecture, but he's talking about the central sensory character of encountering architecture. And his point is that the eyes are the least dependable sense, and touch, the skin, is the most dependable. Now, what does that mean? I don't really know what that means, but that's what he's alleging in his thinking. And the idea is that we need to connect with something. You know, I'm going to connect with my computer here and connect with paper and connect with, in this case, oh, this is the age of anxiety, you know, connect with it tangibly in some way. Um, and so over the last 2 weeks, 3 weeks, I've made 3 long road trips, and I listened to William Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury, which is reputedly one of the most difficult. It's kind of like James Joyce's Ulysses, one of the most difficult things to read because he's using multiple narrators, all, particularly in the first section, all mashed up together. And and a good um, reader of that, and so I was listening to that as I was driving, and I saw it as a totally different way than I'd had when I'd
Oh,
read that book
yeah,
back when I was in college,
yeah.
and so it opened up something that I could see myself in those settings, you know, as they're walking down this road or whether they're encountering this and they're screaming up the stairs or whatever they're doing. It became more realistic, maybe. So that's what's kind of triggered this. And but what I also see is that if you take let's just take, I have a stack of books of poetry here. Let's just take something from George Herbert, you know, and you know, you're going to read that and you're not going to read it fast. You're going to you're going to take time to read it, but you're not listening to it. You're actually contemplating. There's that word, connect you. And when you read it, and I'm curious about this human interplay between these senses as we embrace the world as it is being presented to us today.
One of the kind of core tenet of a podcast series I did last year, which is the podcast series is called Be More Poet. And the central idea within it is that poetry and the poetic does enable us to see things differently. Partly because it is the way in which the person who is creating and crafting these words sees from a different angle. You know, to take someone like Mary Oliver, who's big, one of her big themes in her work is pay attention, notice, look at things differently, take time to actually see what it is that you are seeing. I think that people who have a poetic bent, you know, are, when you look at their work, when you experience their work, you do enter into a way of seeing sometimes things that are very familiar, but seeing them from a very different position. And why that's important for me, and why I think it's important for the time we're at in the world, is I don't think we need, in one sense, I don't think we need more answers to things. What we actually need is a different way of seeing what is already there. And that is my concern about whether there are things that over time we have lost because we've got so caught up in the busyness, the hustle, the productivity, the fast, the speed of everything, that we've actually lost our ability to see things well, and therefore to see each other well, and to see the world around us well. And poetry is not something that, poetry isn't usually something that grabs you by the scruff of the neck and says, look. It does a, oh, why don't you just come with me for a bit? Just come over here. What can you see here?
Walk with me for a while.
Yeah, walk with me for a while. Because you can't rush poetry. You know, if you try to rush poetry, it's like trying to gobble up fast food.
Yeah.
You know, you won't get any benefit from it.
Well, what I see is that we're living in a time of great change, and it's chaotic, and it's hard, and it's harsh, and it forces us to close ourselves in to protect ourselves from the harshness of it, and this is what caused me to respond by wanting to create a poet's list of podcast guests, because what I went to this event in Charlotte in February, where there were poets and there were essayists, and they all read, and it was really remarkable. And I really liked the poets, and so I invited one of them to come on, Kevin Latour, and we had a conversation, and it was then this sense of maybe poetry is a vehicle for bringing people together, bringing healing to the world, maybe releasing us from the fear of change. It may be this catalyst that has been hiding in plain sight for centuries that now we can embrace as something that can carry us into a better place.
I like that, and I can see that. I think I would be slightly wary about being instrumental about it, about creating it as an instrument. But having said that, because the idea of being instrumental suggests that you can shape the change that you're trying to create just through using
Here are the
words in a
10 poems
particular
that
way.
change your life.
Yeah. Well, I've actually got that book. There is a book called 10 Poems That Change Your Life.
I'm not surprised.
But
that's that utilitarian.
But actually, it's not change your life in kind of an instrumental kind of way. It's 10 poems that connect with a part of you that maybe has been dormant, or maybe has been hidden over. Because whilst there are there are some times when I've seen the effect of poetry to be causing people, in that sense, to rise up and to, you know, fight for justice or whatever. Usually, it's an inner change that's being countenanced here. And the interesting thing is that if you have a bit like a, people assume that if you go into an art gallery and you stand before a painting and you talk to somebody else who's gone into that art gallery and stood before the painting, you'll both have seen the same thing. No.
Not at all.
But likewise with a poem, or with the poet, and particularly if it's poetry that has been, particularly if it's poetry that has been allowed to mature at its own rate. Now, some poems, some poetry does come almost completely formed. And I know some poets for whom that's how they do poetry. It comes completely formed. For most others, there's a kernel. There's something in there, and certainly for me, this is the case. I'm touching something, and I don't know what it is, and I've got to let that do its work in me, and iterate its outward manifestation, its outwards expression. And what somebody else gets from it may be completely different to anything that I'd started off with, thinking that this was what it was about.
Yeah, I see that. And I mean, a large one of the reasons I'm doing the podcast is because I want to transcend that barrier that exists between people, where we may look at the same thing but have different things. And I want to cross that barrier and say, I want to understand how that person understands this. And so that
but that sounds like it's a cognitive thing, and
it's much more of a life
I'm
experience.
not sure that poetry sits within
Right.
within a box that is kind of framed in that way. In the same way, I think I mentioned earlier on, this question of you read it. I mean, for me, I have for many years, I have existed in the cycle of reading the Psalms.
Yeah.
And I have no idea how many times I've read the whole book of Psalms, because I just go each day I read a new psalm, and it's, I don't know, 15 years, 20 years. I have no idea how long it is. I have no idea. But I tell you, each time I come to a psalm, even one that I know really, really well, it'll speak differently.
But you're reading it in your life, the moment of your life as it is right now.
Absolutely. That's absolutely right. Which is why we can read Shakespeare, and even though the language is not language we would currently speak, there may be something within it that offers an insight or offers a recognition, a resonance that we aren't expecting.
Yes. I see it as a form of conversation. And
who do you think the conversation is between?
it's between, well, it's on different levels. The poet is having a conversation with himself.
Yeah.
And they're articulating what is going on inside of them. And that's the most important of the conversations.
Yeah.
But then if they publish it and they distribute it to the world, they're in essence saying, I'm having a conversation with you, And we may never talk about this, but you're going to have a conversation with your own self as you respond to my conversation with myself. And that's what I mean about crossing this line so that there's this
Yeah.
interaction where like on Sunday, I went to a wedding down in South Carolina of a friend of mine's daughter. And my friend is from Benin in West Africa. So it was
Mm-hmm.
a West African wedding,
Mm.
just marvelous. And I
Yes.
was talking to one of the African guests, and we were just sharing, who we are, what we do.
Yeah.
And I said, isn't it remarkable is that we come from such different worlds, but we have so much in common? And he said, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think to me, that's the troubling thing about the world we live in, where everything is organized around um, divisiveness and that sort of thing.
Mm.
So where I'm coming, the circle I'm coming to is that poetry is a way of bringing people together in conversation about things that matter, but they matter differently, but they still matter, and that the conversation is really about those sort of things, and it has a chance to to bring healing. That's what I'm also seeing. It has a chance to
Yeah.
heal the environment that we live in. And
Yeah.
I'm definitely not saying that in an instrumentalist or utilitarian
No.
way, because you can't program this.
No.
This is about how we live as human beings in context of other human beings, and
Mm.
that's what I'm seeing.
Yeah. And I think there are times when um, the world, the place, the world, the time, the body that we inhabit is going to be unknown to another. I think of two things here. One is I think I ended up developing poetic expression, particularly in the through the pandemic, and we had to shield for much longer than most other people because of clinical vulnerabilities in our household, and what I discovered was that living here where we do, which is in this beautiful hidden valley in southwest Wales, where we're surrounded by nature, it is what I live every day. It's what I see every day. It's what I notice, the little changes, and I found the way of capturing some of that in my writing that actually gave people a sense of an experience that they were not having, but they could have vicariously. So that's one thing. The
Hmm.
second thing was I'm conscious of the work of the poet. Oh dear, what's his name? Roger. Oh dear, he's embarrassing. I can't remember his surname. He was a poet laureate in the UK. He won the T.S. Eliot Prize in 2019. He's an African writer, but who has lived in London for a long time. Roger Robinson, and so his background is Afro-Caribbean, but he's been living in London a long time, and he lives very close to where Grenfell Towers was, which you may remember was a horrendous 77-story fire that broke out in a block of flats that was social housing, and I mean many people died, and he used poetry was a vehicle for bearing witness to and holding trauma, as well as the really difficult questions as to how could this have happened. it needed to have expression in the same way as his, his familial background, with something called the Windrush generation, which in the UK was people from the Caribbean, particularly from Jamaica and Barbados, who came to the UK on the on the promise of a better life, and then who were not well treated.
Mhm.
And his work using poetry, both his poems and him enabling others to give expression through poetry, has been extraordinary in terms of bridging divides,
Hmm.
enabling understandings, perspectives. And that's for me is actually part of the thing about poetry, because unlike essays and expressions of thoughts and concepts and information, poetry is never coming at you, straight on. It's always coming from the side. And therefore some of the shields that we have, it penetrates some of those shields, some
Mhm.
of those things where we're saying, I don't really want to look at that.
No.
That's a bit uncomfortable, really. Or, golly, actually it enables the light to come in ways that facts certainly don't.
So it has the effect of broadening our vision.
Oh, absolutely. Because it touches us from the inside. Yeah.
Yeah. Because as you were describing, saying that, what I was seeing is, we get focused, and when
Yes.
we focus, we narrow down. Got this
Yes.
little thing that we're looking at. But
Yes.
what matters is that there's all this stuff that's in our peripheral vision that's happening
Yeah.
that we should be turning our head and that's interesting. And
Yeah. And then as you're expressing that also makes me express the value of the way that poetry causes us to slow down. You can't skim read poetry.
no,
Or you can say, I've read this poem, I got to the end of it, but it hasn't done anything to you because you've just skipped over it. So there is something about, if I want to use an analogy, you poetry is not about going down the highway at 70 miles an hour. Because when you're barreling down the highway at 70 miles per hour, all you can do is focus on this. If you stop to admire the views, you're going to be in trouble. Poetry is more like walking. It's at walking pace. It's human scale, but also it's unhurried. You can't hurry.
maybe
And
that
for me, that's why I love it so much, because
I agree.
it means that you can distill something into just a few words, but which those words, if you hold them, they're like a lozenge in your mouth, and you you go through whole cycles of experience with just 5 lines. But writing 5 lines of poetry is very different to writing 500 words of an essay or a long piece.
I've had moments when I've produced 4,000 words in a day,
I know Ed, you're in a world,
but
you're in a category of your own. I mean, just
while that may be my capacity for creation, it doesn't actually express everything that I'm seeing. And what I realize, this is what I'm realizing, is that I probably should, you know, try to write in verse or in poetic form merely for the exercise of being um, not so dependable in what I ordinarily do.
It depends what it is you're trying to do.
Well, I think it's the search for something. I'm always on a search for an answer, and
Oh, poetry doesn't give you answers.
well, but you see,
No,
that's
it
where
doesn't promise answers at all. In fact, it's going to leave you with more questions. And
okay. Let me frame it this way: there is a
okay,
question begging for an answer down here, and the poetry happens in the middle. And the poetry doesn't answer the question. The poetry simply changes the questioner's perception of things.
oh, let me add to that, because actually that suggests this is a linear progression. And one of the things that I know of from poetry is that actually you end up on a completely different path.
Okay, I grant that too. I have right here on my computer, I have, I think, 5 or 6 Substack posts that I have begun. Some there's a title, some there's several hundred words, but they're just they were just created to get the stuff out of my
Yeah,
head.
yeah,
And I see that poetry is a way of digging deep within yourself and finding ways to express what's in there that the traditional, hyper rational cognitive
yeah.
chat GPT form of language cannot suffice.
I agree. I agree. I think it's. I think for me, I think I sense that the poetic form and the way of seeing that is the poetic is an enormous gift. Not, I don't mean gift in terms of, hey, there's someone who's got that gift, but just it's a gift to us of not having
Yeah.
to be operating in our left hemisphere. It's a gift of not trying to convince someone of a point of view. It's a gift of inviting others into a world that they may not know, not so that they know everything about that world, but just so that they've had an experience of it. If I think about someone like Mark Doty and his expression, a lot of his poetry is very urban based. He loves New York. The whole scene, the whole. I'll read his stuff or hear his stuff and go, my goodness, that's a world I know nothing about, and it leaves me exhausted at the end of it. I don't think I'm. That's enough. I've had enough of New York. I don't need any more New York.
Do you remember the first time that you uh, was intentional about creating something which people might call poetry?
Yes, I do. Um, yeah, it was actually on the creatives workshop, a Kimbo creatives workshop that Seth Godin did, and I was on the first cohort of that, and it started just as lockdown. I mean, we were about a month into the program, and then everything got closed down, and therefore, as a consequence, this space became much more important to people, and they had the capacity for it, and Seth and the team very kindly kind of like elongated it, so it became almost a 6-month program rather than just a couple of months. And I was starting to write things, and people were starting to say, "That's poetry," and I was going, "I don't think so. I think it might be poetic." And I've always had an when I'm writing, not the kind of formal stuff for board papers and academic articles and things like that, then I would veer in that direction, and so I started exploring that and started being more intentional. And then towards the very end of that program, and that's where I met Gail, who you've also spoken to a couple of times.
Yeah.
And we were both involved with an open mic thing. And I decided that I wanted to write a longer piece, almost as a celebration of the workshop and the people I'd encountered, but also as a sort of blessing over people. And within that, I was quite influenced by John O'Donoghue, who was an Irish poet, priest, theologian, who died in 1928. And his work often has a sense of blessing about it. And sometimes, there's one of his books which is explicitly a book of blessings for different situations. So I wrote it. So in that sense, it was both intentional in terms of what I was trying to capture, but also it was intentional in terms of style. So I was leaning on some of the approaches that I was very familiar with within John O'Donoghue's work. And so right at the end of this workshop, I put it out there, as well as I, on an open mic, actually read it. And that was interesting, because that was I want to do this, I want to write this, I want it to be saying the things I want it to say in the way I want to say it. Because often now I find that when I write more overtly poetic pieces, things that you would call poetry, it's because I've encountered something or I'm exploring something, and it becomes the best way in which I can express it. Mm-hmm. Which is actually a bit different to saying, I'm going to write a poem for this occasion, for this situation, for these people.
Which is more utilitarian. Has a utilitarian purpose to it.
It has, certainly it has a more external orientation.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So all of these ways of being poetic, and I think I'd like to speak about that as ways of being poetic, allows for this sense of the poetic to define us in much broader ways than simply the words and spaces that we create on a piece of paper.
Yes, and the thing I've become even more aware of is that there is a craft here. And in the same way as the craft of a woodworker, who will look at the wood itself and be asking the question, how does this piece of wood want to give expression? You know, what is it speaking of? What is its form? What's the grain? How do I need to honor the wood itself? I think there is a craft with poetry, which is about both the honoring of the words and the form, as well as honoring the essence, the intent, the motivation, the heart of it.
Do
And I
you,
think I've understood more about that as time's gone on, as I have written more intentionally. And you know, there have been times when actually I've been commissioned to actually write things, and that draws you even more clearly into what are you crafting here, and what are the, because it's not just it's not a question of rhyme. I rarely use rhyme in my work, but there might be echoes. So there might be places where the experience, the sound, the feel, the mouth shape of this line here actually has its echo down here. And therefore the order of things and where they land on the page, where they land in the mouth, where they where what the rhythm is, as well as what the juxtapositions are. Where is it you actually want to do something that means that people thought they were doing like this, and then suddenly you go like that, because actually you need to insert a different kind of energy at that point. And that's the craft.
does the craft involve becoming more knowledgeable about syntax and punctuation and how sentences are formed? And I'm curious because
Yeah.
the rhythm of a poem um, doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the syntax of a sentence.
Yeah. Oh, rarely.
And where the punctuation appears actually does, because it is a signal of something.
Where the line endings happen and line
Yes.
beginnings happen. Yeah.
See that? Yeah, this is more of the fascination I have with this. So why don't we hear you read one of your poems to us?
Oh, there's so many. Oh, what kind of poem do you want?
I don't know. I mean,
Okay, can I give you two? Can I give you two then? Can I give
yes,
you
please
two?
do.
Um, Let me just see. One is, the first is a poem, um, one of those poems that kind of emerged from here as a result of me walking around in the valley and thinking, and because I do write and publish every day, then I'm always just aware of where do I need to be paying attention, what do I need to be seeing. And as I've gone back over my poems, I've realized that so many of them are, they're actually about poems of becoming,
Huh.
and uh, becoming in numbers of ways. And I think that's an expression of not just me and my orientation and the things that I'm interested in, but also of living here and being here through the seasons and the tiny changes that happen each day, and being with the animals and being with the wildlife and so on. So this is a poem that came out of observing these beautiful ferns, um, as I don't know if you're aware, but there are certain ferns that come up from their base like this, and they go like this, and then whoa,
Or like a
there's these
swan.
little stuff. Yes, it's just astonishing.
Yeah.
Um, so this is a poem that came out of that, and then the second poem is a poem I was commissioned to write. So in that sense, was more intentional and had a context in which it was going to be used. So this is called The Great Unfurling. Waiting, yearning to unfurl brilliance from Earth's womb. New life ready to emerge, clothed with gorgeous colours of possibility. Breathing out, not sighs, but deep exclamations of joy. The pain of labour letting go, forgotten in a moment of release. Becoming is not a process, it's a practice of life.
Mhm. Very true. Very true.
Absolutely. So this second one is again has some of the echoes of John O'Donoghue and his blessings. And I was asked to write a blessing for Easter, and this was Easter a couple of years back, and it was specifically a poem to be then embodied in music and visual. So I wrote it for something called the Presence Project, which Andy Hunter, he's a creative, he's a musician, he's a DJ, he's a filmmaker, all sorts of really interesting things. So these are the words that were then put to music, and then an astonishing video footage created for it. But these are the words, and this was for Easter. There is an after. May you know that there is an after, where light has pierced the darkness with a single shaft, and night is no more. There is an after, where brokenness is restored, doubt becomes sight, and those who are weary are renewed. There is an after, where beauty rises from ashes of lives shattered and torn apart, and colours return. There is an after, where stony isolation gives way to the gentleness of being named and known again. There is an after, where hope finds its voice, and we join together in the anthem of new life. May you know, really know deep inside, that there is an after, because love wins.
It's beautiful. Well, I thank you for being here and being my colleague in the discovery of things that is beyond the normal tale of life. And you provide that, and I've every time, I think almost every time I've been with you online, because we've never been together physically. You've read one of your poems. So if you've read, or if you've said something of a poetic nature that has touched everyone that was there.
Thank you.
And and so I thank you for that um, presence that you end up having because of what has been going on inside of you that you're now expressing to the world.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you that you, thank you that you give the platform for this to be explored and to be affirmed. And what I would hope too with your current looking at poets and the poetic and the platform that that might hold for people to explore things differently, that two things would happen. That yes, people would hear other voices and have other ways of seeing things that might be familiar or unfamiliar to them, but which gives them access to a way of seeing. But also that people themselves might venture to express something that's within themselves
Yeah.
and not be constrained by syntax and because poetry can be incredibly freeing, and I think there are more people out there with more things to say. They just don't know it yet.
I'm going to read you a little something I wrote yesterday on LinkedIn to introduce my my podcast with Sarah K. Mooney, and I wrote, "Poetry is liquid.
Yeah.
It flows over and through. It penetrates, is absorbed, disappears, and transforms the receiving party. It serves as insight, protest, and a means of healing.
Yeah.
Poetry of Sarah K. Mooney fits well here. I'm glad for her to be one of the Eddie Network poets." And
Yeah.
that's what I see. It's not that this is an expression of one's ego in the world,
Mm-mm.
expression of something deeper and more alive. And I'm
Yeah.
grateful to have been influenced by people like you, other poets who I'm calling you a poet if that's okay.
Yeah.
Um, well, people who have a poetic sensibility, let's say it that.
Mm.
I think that opens the hard shell case that most people are living in today out of fear of change and
Yeah.
um, where I feel like, well, change is life.
It is. It is. One of the things that I found helpful in going back and looking at the things that I'd written and thinking about today was picking up this phrase that I'd used some while ago in the end of the poem that I read to you first of all, which is about becoming is a practice of life. And the invitation to become feels very different than the invitation to simply change.
Hmm.
Because and I've played a lot with this question of, is it about change? Is it about becoming? Is it transformation? And my background's always been about change and transformation in whatever I've done. And I think I've realised that becoming is a more human invitation,
Hmm.
or is a human invitation.
Yeah.
That and there's a sense where We never stop becoming, not until we die. You know, it isn't something that stops when you get to a certain age.
It's sort of our response to change. That comes from outside. We become what we need to be in the moment that we are. Um, and some of the people that I've had on here have talked about this very thing, that
Interesting.
there is no kind of fixed point.
No.
It's always the past, the present, the future all mashed up together in a dynamism that frees us from having to be one thing and only one thing,
Oh,
allows us to
absolutely.
change and
You and me both have had so many different hats over the years.
yeah, that is really true. Um, I am very grateful to know you and grateful to have had you on. And um, my hope for all of you who are watching or listening is that you find some place in your life where you have a way of expressing those deep inner realities that are not just the anxiety and the fear and the trauma that you've experienced, but much more the beauty and the sense of hope that you have. Because I'm convinced that everyone has that, but it gets suppressed. And I see that trying to articulate the feelings that you have, but maybe in non-linear and non-correct syntactical form is a way of discovering yourself as a human being who has something to contribute and to offer to the world. So if you do, then share that with us here in the comments, because when you share it, then you join with us, and other people will see it, and you will have some modicum of impact. You will have created something that will matter to someone, and that's important. That's why I'm here.
Absolutely.
So thanks again, Sue,
Absolutely.
and I hope to see you again soon. And we'll see you all next time here on the Eddie Network podcast. Bye bye.
Bye.